What up? Mike, you should be able to just ask to join, and then there we go.
I need to turn this, don't I?
You're sideways.
Yeah, let's try this. Oh.
There it is.
Upside down? There we go.
Just keep people guessing. It'll be good.
There we go. Put it back. Oh, there we go. All right, there we are. Am I on there?
All right. How are you, man?
Good. Good.
Are you giving the 1-year-old and the 3-year-old like a heads up that the dad's on the phone?
My 3-year-old's playing. We're going to hear her any minute, and my 1-year-old will wake up from a nap any second, so you're about to hear everybody.
I'm good with it, man. I'm good with it. So the disclaimer I have to give is I have a dog that at some point we'll see somebody going by out front. We'll need to let him know that, hey, this is my territory. So you mentioned that depending on how the day went, the cocktail hour may involve.
It's been a good day. We're going
okay.
Have you been to 30A? You ever been to 30A? It's a beautiful strip of beach down like near Panama City Beach, Florida. You ever been this way?
If I have, it was so long ago that I wouldn't know it by name.
So it's a beautiful strip. It's called 30A, and then there's this beer called Grayton Beer, and they make one called 30A, and it's beautiful. It's a beach blonde ale, and I'm happy to drink it with you.
So you're taking it easy this afternoon, all right? So
yeah.
My joke was going to be, if you had whiskey, like you mentioned, my joke was going to be to hold this up and say I was going vodka or water if I was pulling the move I used to pull in college.
I didn't know how many drinks to prepare. So, what we just got was the Terramana tequila that The Rock just put out.
Okay.
Have you tried that yet?
I have not.
I'm
boring, man. I'm boring.
Well, I am too. But I had a wild hair at the liquor store and decided to try some of the Terramana tequila. But it wasn't time yet. A beer will suit me just fine.
Oh, no, fair enough. I was going to joke, my move back in college, I didn't really drink. But then people who were drinking would see you and act like, what's wrong with you? Like, why are you not partying it up? Right. So I'd drink water, and I'd be like, well, how do you know it's not vodka? And that was my passive-aggressive way of getting out of that, I guess. Yeah, but
yeah, I think I was the opposite. We drank a lot in college, but now not so much. Just a little bit.
I was too paranoid. I was like, if anything impacts athletics, I'll be too upset.
So I played ice hockey at a Division III school, and it was competitive.
Where at?
At Skidmore College in upstate New York. You ever heard of it?
I've heard of it. I'm no expert, but
yeah, it's a small school. It's an awesome school in a great little city called Saratoga Springs, and so I went there to play ice hockey, and what an awesome experience. But it certainly was not an alcohol-free scenario.
Gotcha. So in terms of hockey, like not every D1 school has it. So is it the case that it was like really at a pretty high level? It just happened to be labeled D3, or like
it was a high level.
How is the hockey world?
Yeah, so it's certainly high level, but there's a distinction. There's really D2 is kind of phased out. There's a D1. They're like the tops, and what we got at D3 was the best players who didn't want to schedule from a D1 schedule, and then those of us fighting to try to play at the highest level that we possibly could. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. I just asked because my son plays soccer collegiately. And he's in a really high level D3 conference, but then you get into this weird sort of conversation where like almost no Big Ten school has men's soccer. And so it's not analogous to really talking about like basketball as D1 and those kinds of things. And I didn't know if hockey was the same way or not.
Yeah, it's definitely there's a difference. There's a difference. You see, sometimes I haven't played hockey in a long time here in Florida. There's nothing in Tallahassee.
I was going to say
there are in the other cities, but not here. But when I was playing regularly, if you had like a pickup game and some of the big guys came out, it's a whole other level. You realize real quick.
It shows you a little bit of the gap.
Well, you get in exercise science and sports science because you can't play at that level.
A lot of coaches say that too. Yeah, well, for sure. So we have a common friend in Mr. Chris Bach, right?
That's right.
And so this morning I sent him an email and I was like, hey, so Mike and I are going to talk. Do you have any questions, right, that you think it might be good for the two of us to talk about? Yeah. It's probably pretty fair. So to be fair, the core of his questions, he sent 3, are pretty good. At least it seems to me, right? You may judge otherwise, but it seems to me.
I would expect so. He's a bright guy.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. He has gone a bit Faulkner in terms of the length of the questions. Okay. So I'm going to use them, but I'm not going to use his phrasing because by the time I got done reading them, you couldn't actually answer them in the allotted time that we have. But no, they're pretty good, and I'll probably kind of play off of a couple of them a little bit as well.
Can you use his Tennessee accent just for effect?
Probably not without insulting a lot of people in Tennessee.
Okay.
And, I'm not interested in doing that. So he basically, he really does have kind of a central theme, at least for 2 of them, which is sort of the crossover between the academic world, research, and really application. So hopefully I've done him justice. That's how I would summarize kind of his thought process. And I certainly have the sense you guys have maybe talked about some of this before.
Right.
Right. But so one of the things he talked about, or wanted us to talk about, is bridging the gap between research and the applied setting. And he's curious to know if in sort of your, I think 10 plus years of experience, if you feel like that gap is closing, or if it's still roughly the same, or maybe even getting worse because of disinformation, et cetera. So that does sound very Chris Bach. What are your thoughts there?
So, what this stems from is the sports science conference that Chris and his group put on a few years ago. Was that 2 or 3 years ago when we met there at the stadium?
Yeah. And the symposium, yeah.
Yeah, so I gave a talk there on this topic, on how I thought researchers could.
I was there.
And that's essentially the theme behind it. Is it closing? It depends where you are. There are still people working in silos, and it's an extremely difficult thing to navigate. Like, people are fighting for territory, and the essential focus of a researcher is different from a sports scientist working with athletes. And so there's this big change. Like, most people in my position are publish or perish. If we don't get to publish the data from a study, we pretty much don't want to do it because that's your job. Now, on the athlete side and the coach's side, they need information yesterday. And so, one of the things that I've had a conversation with Chris, and I think we may have talked about this years ago, but it was, with that big gap, how do you get into a scenario where I can, as a researcher, give good information to a coach or an athlete quickly? And that's the big problem, because say you have a question and I'm like, yep, we can answer it. But listen, it's a master's thesis project. So it's going to take 6 months for this to be written up and then approved by a committee. And then it's going to take another, say, month or 2 to get approval from the Institutional Review Board for Research Ethics. And then we're going to get to a place where we can run the data, but we can't really give you information for a year and a half. You're like, no, I don't want that. That's way too long to get me any information.
Right.
We run into that a lot. And honestly, here at Florida State, it took the right people in the right positions who were willing to communicate well to have even a good conversation. So we were real lucky here. Our head of strength and conditioning, she was phenomenal. And she approached us and we had lunch. And now we have basically, before COVID, we had like monthly meetings with all the strength and conditioning staff and all of our staff at the ISSM. And just to share ideas and see where we might have commonalities and what we might be able to work with in terms of getting data quickly. But we're still hitting our heads against the wall. And I think Chris often talks about it, and I believe the same thing. Like, we kind of overpromise what we can deliver to coaches and athletes too much. And we need to take a step back. And when I met with all of the coaching staff last year, which was a great invitation to go talk to them, I made sure to approach that like, I don't know what we can give you, but we should at least have a conversation about what's possible, as opposed to saying, I can give you any data you want and give you anything you need. And I think that was a good approach because they responded to it. I had some good inquiries from coaches and assistant coaches, and probably 4 different sports came up after that to really talk to us about what can be done. And frankly, we're still trying to figure that out. We're really trying to figure that out at Florida State, how to work together with academics and athletics. There's a want for it, but until you have a scenario like Nebraska has, where you hire a sports scientist researcher from athletics, that you work athletics, and the goal's a little different, it's going to be really hard to people can play nice, but really hard to give data that's worthwhile. Unless you have a scenario where athletics is hiring these sports scientists, or you have like a 50-50 position where it's very clear that it's not only publish or perish, it's also the communication with the coaching staff.
So does a lot of that boil down to the maybe this is not the right term, but the publishing process? In other words, like the approval process you have to go through, like it just doesn't lend itself to the fact that I need to win this season. Maybe is that a bit of an oversimplification? Like,
no, I mean, it's so long. Here's an example. Like, we have had papers that you say we have all the data and I can give it to the coaches, but in the publishing process, if I submit that to a journal, you might wait at minimum 6 or 8 weeks. At maximum, you might wait 6 or 8 months to get any feedback. And then they say, it's good, but you need to fix this, this, and this. All right, so I fix it on a weekend. I turn it back in, and it's 6 more months before I get any feedback again. And so now you're like a year and a half into this before there's an approval. And then the approval goes on, and it's like, okay, you're good, but it's only online. So it doesn't really count as a publication yet until it's actually published in print, or now virtual print, and has like a number and an issue number and a volume number. And all that stuff just takes forever. I think that there are ways that we can work with athletics as researchers, but it's going to be strategic. For example, I think that we could probably hire better. We could probably hire and bring on and train master's students or PhD students, but the university has to allow very applied research as an avenue for getting a doctorate or a dissertation. And in some universities, it needs to be more mechanistic than I can have as a doctoral student to work on that as their actual dissertation. If it's a master's project, we can do it, but it's very difficult because you only have them for 2 years. So by the time you train them and then the coaches trust them, if that happens, they're gone and they move on. And, so much of it's the relationships that are built. It took me 6 years or so before we had a real meaningful conversation with athletics. And then that relationship came because there were staff in place where everybody was secure with themselves, and everybody just wanted to try to learn and see what resources we had right here. But it amazes me still. I mean, I've been in this business for a long time now, and we're still outsourcing paying for other people to come in and deliver information that we do every day in our facility. It's always like, your kids don't want to listen to you; they want to listen to somebody else that says the same exact thing.
Sure.
That they want to hear, right?
Sure. Oh well, yeah. There's a tangent by itself, right? When you were kind of walking through some of that process, one of the things that struck me, and so I don't know if this is a friction point or for a conversation, but so when you as a researcher kind of go through the process of compiling your data, right, and then analyzing like what that data is telling you, like you're still fairly far away from anything that resembles being published, right? And sort of closing the loop on publish versus perish, if I can steal that phrase from you. Is there a point in there where there is a conversation you can have with a given sport or multiple sports in terms of the question you were trying to answer, where it's not published, but like as an experienced scientist, you're able to draw some conclusions that you can share with them? Sure. Or
yeah,
is that trying to sort of shoehorn in a result too early?
No, you can certainly have those conversations, and that's something that we try to do in some of the projects that we have done with athletics. And that's a fine way to do it. The problem is oftentimes I'll ask a question that they don't care about. So it's really about communicating. It's like, I want to know about some metabolic thing that's going on because I think it's cool, but they don't care about that. They want to know about, strength or jump height or some type of performance angle or recovery. Sometimes we look at that, sometimes we don't. And so really it's just changing the conversation. It's you need to have someone who's willing to say, what is your question? Okay, now let us answer that.
Yeah.
As opposed to trying to force anything that you want. And honestly, a lot of researchers are too big on themselves to go away from their personal questions and to give that up to help the team. And that's a challenge. I mean, you got these egos in our world in every area that I'm not going to do that. That's not what I want to know, and it changes it.
Everyone's got an ego to some degree, so guilty as charged too. Like I'm not excluding myself. Yeah. So my wife's sitting over on the couch and nodding her head right now, like, oh yeah. But
the other thing to think about is funding. Like, how do you pay for this stuff? And if you want to answer any really good questions, sometimes it's expensive, and sometimes you need specific equipment, or you need to have blood drawn or saliva samples or something that answers the question.
Right.
And then you have a cost. Two, there's a time to that. Who's going to pay for that? If I go to athletics, they're going to say, you can do it, but we're not going to pay for that. So then we need to find
depending on their level of interest in said question. Is that?
Yeah. Or do they even allow it? There's straight policies where they won't allow blood samples, at least to be used from a research standpoint. And so we struggle with it a lot. The best thing that we have here at Florida State is that we have an open conversation. And Elisa, the head strength and conditioning coach, she's awesome, and she allows us to have this conversation all the time. And then I get
that's awesome.
Invited into the high performance team occasionally. So the best example is we built the relationship enough that they asked me to be on a search committee for someone they were hiring, and that's a good thing because then they have sort of buy-in to what we're up to. But to make it work in terms of getting data out, we're still working on that. We had a master's student thesis that was working with track and field athletes, and she's gone on now to her PhD, but she did phenomenal work testing these athletes. But now we're talking about 3 years ago, basically 2 or 3 years ago of data, and we're just about to publish this. But there's a whole new team, so now does it matter anymore? With how delayed it was.
Well, they could, even if they've moved on, like if it's me, right. As soon as I know you published that information, I'm diving in because I had an initial interest in the question. So I'm going to retain that interest, right?
You as the athlete. So what's happening is that question was driven probably half by the master's student that was involved with that, Hannah. She was phenomenal, Hannah Saylor. She's at UNC Chapel Hill now, working with Abby Smith-Ryan, who's a phenomenal researcher there. When she was with us, it was basically half her question and half the strength staff, where they wanted to know about basically it was session RPE and acute chronic workload ratio, and then not injury but performance. How did the track athletes perform in 100-meter or 200-meter sprints, and was there some kind of correlation there? So basically it was all statistical data that was being pulled for that. But yeah, it's taken a long time to get those data together. But we did have conversations along the way, and that's probably our best example of where it worked well. And the word spreads that once people started knowing that we were working with them and really trying to help. We weren't trying to like take over. We weren't trying to do any of that. Really just analyzing, assessing, and helping on the backside. It sort of freed up everybody a little bit to ease up and just start to have a better relationship.
Well, that's cool. That's cool. So segueing just a touch, obviously you probably had some things you were working on, some questions you were trying to answer prior to COVID-19.
Yeah.
And then those got put on, I assume, at least pause, right?
Yeah.
Are you able to talk about like what some of those questions were? And then I'm kind of curious, do you envision being able to get back to them, or how's that going to work out for you?
Yeah, the interruption, as you would imagine, was huge in terms of what we were able to do. We had two directly in our, so we have a lot of like tangential studies in our university that we're collaborating on, or across the world in some cases, but directly in our lab we had two ongoing projects that have already begun. One of them was really cool, a new area in sports nutrition. So it was looking directly at collagen peptide supplementation. Collagen peptides are the biggest protein on the block right now. Their sales numbers are, I don't know about after COVID, but they were going through the roof more than other types of proteins, because there were some data that existed about recovery, some that existed about joint pain, range of motion, and various aspects of how that works. And we were interested in looking at it in a different population and then dosing strategies. So we looked at lifelong athletes. So that would be people like me and you, couched into this category of very active, or at least highly active your whole life, or at least for a long period of time. And then we were trying to dose to see if nothing, so zero intake or a medium dose or a high dose, was going to be most effective. But this was a 9-month study. And so one of my doctoral students, Shalom Fuller, was working on that. She's phenomenal, going to be a huge star in this field when she finishes.
Someone already gave her a shout out on, in the comments below. Yeah.
So she's been awesome with this and handling the information. But we had about 7 or 8 people to finish right when we're starting to hear about getting shut down in 9 months. So that's a long period of time to supplement and then lose the ability to test somebody. And we also have bone density as a marker, and that takes a long time to have any kind of change if you're going to see it. So 9 months is about what you would want to see. And she was creative with it. So we got on the phone, we sorted out people who were within 2 weeks of finishing. We tested early because we knew we would lose the ability to test anybody. And then we had, I think it was 3 or 4 more people, maybe 5, that still had to finish this summer. And so we teamed up and wrote some justification to the university to say where we were, what we were doing, and how we were going to do it. So she moved like 7 and 8 month testing to online only. So she would send them questionnaires instead of having them come into the lab to do them. And we missed some testing. And then the 9 month, that's the one we really need. And as long as people are healthy, we have a plan to finish those folks, and we're allowed from the university one-on-one only, mask and gloves required, only one person a day. There are all these rules in place to finish the testing. Then we just sent them the remaining months of supplementation They used to come into the lab every month to get that. So we had to change some things with the design that were minimal, and she'll be able to actually finish that study. And we're excited about it. You know, 6 and 9 months in an active population that's a little bit older that could really benefit from something if it does work. We're really excited to see those results.
Well, it's great to hear that, you know, even though you had to shift a little bit just in terms of, well, some very actionable steps, right? In terms of how you had to go about doing some of that, at least it'll be to completion, if not perfectly how it was envisioned. Like, it sounds like pretty close. So
it's close. I mean, nothing's ever perfect. There's always something.
Yeah.
But we really just wanted to run this out and figure out, all right, what's going on. There was some data that was like so positive with collagen peptide use that it threw a red flag. Like, really? I don't know about that. And in our hands, you know, we've done so much work over all the years, and it's rare when something does anything in terms of a supplement. It is really rare. And we often,
I would think it's got to be incredibly difficult to not be skeptical when it comes to supplementation. There's such a market for it.
There is. And it actually like how people interpret what we do, though, is we're lucky in some sense that we don't typically find results because people trust us, and we just show the data for what it is. You know, we may inherently, even if you don't think about it, want something to work or not. But at the end of the day, that's not our job. We just show what happens, and that's it.
Right.
And so we do get a lot of companies that approach us to try to do work with them because we're a trusted name in the industry in terms of doing supplement research or nutrients or nutraceuticals or what have you. But we're excited about it. She's actually taken this project once we have final data and kind of moving it to subsequent projects for future dissertation work. So we're starting in this new collagen line, which has been a lot of fun so far.
Well, that's cool. That's cool. Well, as a master's athlete, hoping you actually find something to the positive, right?
Yeah,
Need all the help I can get.
We'll see. Yeah, we'll finish those people this summer, and we'll probably hopefully get some data into abstract format to get into, present at some conferences if they come back on sometime in the fall.
Well, eventually they will, right?
Eventually.
Or we'll all still be stuck in Zoom meetings, but you can still try to convey it. So do you have? So let's be optimistic, right? So we're eventually going to come out of this. You're going to be able to get back to looking at some questions that you have a high degree of interest in. So if you're willing to discuss, like, do you have some things that you personally are really looking forward to diving into? It's just a matter of getting back to it.
Yeah, and I think it goes in line with your last question. The other project that was interrupted wasn't so seamless. That one was a little different. And a different doctoral student was looking at a supplement that's been around for a long time, particularly in animals and animal feed studies, basically to keep them alive longer in hot, humid environments for poultry production, essentially, or meat production.
Okay.
And we took the animal data and decided to look at heat tolerance and the ability to withstand heat, and then potentially performance changes in humans with this same product. So it's called betaine. It's been around forever. It's even been done in human trials for a number of different reasons, but most often it's given in such a way that's acute. So they take it one dose and then they do the testing. But in all the animal studies, we kept noticing that the product or the supplement was given in the feed or in the water supply for days, weeks, months, years. And they saw the animal study showed very much a significant improvement in the ability to tolerate heat in long-term dosing. And so we took that and said, okay, the acute human data doesn't show anything, but we think they're doing it wrong. And that's what we're studying from that other one. So we have a heat chamber here. It's hot anyway, but we have a heat chamber.
I was going to say, you have access.
So we use that heat chamber, and we're using cyclists and triathletes. Essentially, some runners are in there too. So these are younger men in this case. We do a lot of female physiology studies too. This one just happens to be in men. And we are preloading and supplementing that product like you would see for someone taking creatine, like someone taking it pre-hand and then, taking it for 5 or 7 days at least before you do any measures to try to load the cell. He was only, I think it was 6 people that were tested when we got the notice that we had to shut down. So there was no ability to save that study in terms of testing this summer. We just have to wait till we get the all clear and can go back in and resume testing. But the implications are huge. If we see anything, the crossover to other sports that are extremely hot and humid, or you're wearing equipment that is protective and then makes you hot, could be massive. I work as on the Science Advisory Board again with Corey Stringer Institute, which is like the premier heat institute because Corey Stringer, as you know, passed away in Minnesota in a preseason training for Vikings. And I'm on that advisory board, and Doug Casa, who runs that place, is very good with that type of information. And anyway, we got involved. He sort of helped us design a little bit of what we were doing with that butane study. But if we see it in this small scale study, I think we can upgrade that military application as well as other athlete populations. You think about here, football, summer, heat. If we have evidence that it works in our small scale, I think we'll start scaling up and seeing how we can use it at a bigger level.
Yeah, that has, well, I don't need to tell you. It's just, that's very interesting. It has a lot of downstream potential impact in, like, some studies, you're going to end up focusing on sort of a narrow range of what could be sort of performance that's impacted, but something as simple as heat, that's everybody to some degree.
Well, and even if performance doesn't change, but we improve the ability to tolerate heat or can keep core temp lower for a longer period of time, that's all positive just for human physiology and not having, an incident, so it'll be hard to show. Performance is extremely hard to measure. So those other scientists like me trying to figure out performance, it is hard to do. I mean, you're looking for the smallest of change that could be impactful. And then how do you have enough people in a study to show that's actually a significant difference? And do the stats really matter? Or is it like the stats don't show it's significant, but look, you're a second or 2 or 3 faster. That's probably important for an athlete. And so the way we interpret this stuff is a challenge. With the way we write for scientific publication, we say no significant difference. But the way you might talk about that to a coach is it wasn't statistically different, but it was a 3-second improvement. I would take a 3-second improvement, or I would take, keeping my core temp down for an extra 10 minutes, because you can get an extra play or 2 in. It's really a difference in languages and how you speak to people.
Oh, absolutely. Like you may have already heard me make this joke. Like, I am constantly just saying I'm the translator. And, I'll also translate to like software development teams or whatever else, but it's still fundamentally the same. And sort of one of the things that you said that I find interesting in terms of how hard it is to measure performance, and I'm sure I'm getting into my own jargon a little bit here, but there's this cascade of sort of causal effects that go into where the athlete is and sort of their environment at any given point in time they're trying to perform. And so it's sort of one of those, I don't really envy like the task of trying to actually then get meaningful measures out of that. So like from an EliteForm perspective, I think what we do is like, we do it in a neat way with cameras, but what we're measuring is pretty simple. Right. It's literally just the movement of the bar. And so like, we're not trying to tap into how hot is the room, right? Or any of those other factors. So then even just, and this is something I'd be interested in knowing, like, how do you go about trying to define the right question? Because when I'll hear coaches talk about performance, usually it's a pretty broad question. And so then as I start to tease apart that question, and try to conduct quality science on it, usually, like oftentimes we need to ask a more focused question. Like, is that just open dialogue, or how do you go through some of that? Or you can tell me that was a really stupid question, and I'm good with that as well.
Well, honestly, finding the right question sometimes is an entire career. I mean, we keep molding it and more questions. Listen, I don't usually answer questions. I come up with more questions every time we run any of these studies.
For sure.
And then you have to answer. So you have a question. You design a study to answer it, but there are always limitations to that study that you've designed. And so someone will say, well, why didn't you do this, that, the other thing? Well, it influences, why don't you follow diet? Well, I didn't have the money to give them all the food, so I had to just let them free eat and just record it. So, there are limitations to all these things, and you don't ever have the best question. You have a question to answer. You design a study to answer a specific question. Usually that's driven by either myself or the doctoral students, and sometimes the funding agency, depending on who it is. Like, I wouldn't ask someone who makes a protein supplement and then try to answer a question about probiotics. Obviously, you have to
sure
where you're going, but I would fall back on how do we advance the science. So we have to do this huge review of literature in any study to figure out what's been done. And you don't,
sure,
there is something to replicating, but that's very hard to get money to replicate something that's been done. So we try to advance the science. What's next? So we test X product, or we do some type of exercise intervention, and it works. Okay, well, what if we mix it up? What if now we add in high intensity training, or what if we add in creatine, or whatever it is, to try to advance the science? So that's the big thing. Getting the question right is hard. And oftentimes we'll finish a study and say, ooh, we should have asked a different question. Or we'll get a reviewer on a paper we submit that says, you messed that all up. What are you doing? Well, if your opinion is we should have answered a different question, that's not the study we ran. We ran it very specifically to answer this question.
Well, if you take an optimistic view, isn't that then just potentially another study you could conduct?
Definitely. Definitely. And the game that we always play, though, is, again, getting funding for these things. So if you get let's say a major European company to provide you some product, are they going to fund a second product study if they've already shown, okay, well, it's here, and we only had this much research investment in that particular part of our marketing strategy?
Right.
I don't know. So yes, it does open up more questions. That's part of the reason why we've been highly successful at the ISSM, is one, awesome students and staff and faculty and energy, but two, like, we have a big team, so everybody can sort of answer a piece of the question, or we can take a large project and split that into smaller ones that people can focus on and really try to move it. We call it a stream of research. If you, in academic world, like, they want to see that study 1 leads to study 2, leads to study 3. You have this beautiful line, but in reality, that's not how it works. You answer like study 3, and then you have study 1 questions. You're like, oh, we probably should have done that first, and you go backwards and then move through the line. So
it's an imperfect world, you're saying?
If you look at my CV, it looks like we planned it all, but that is not how it happened.
Well, that's how you're saying. So
Yep.
Scott Forbes, I saw jumped in and just to ask the question if you have any comments about creatine in the heat.
First of all, Forbes is like the expert on creatine in this world. So thanks, Scott, for that comment. Yeah, I do. People are, hi, Scott, by the way. People are confused about creatine still. People still think it's a anabolic steroid. It still gets media coverage today that it harms the kidneys and the liver and does all this bad stuff. But really, none of that has been shown in actual data. And that's important to note. It's not a steroid. It's a combination of amino acids. And one of the things that anecdotally you hear from people who just buy it at a store and take it is dehydration. And I get emails about it, from either concerned parents or coaches or whatever. my kid's taking this, isn't it going to dehydrate them and blah, blah, blah. The answer is no, and it's not. And
short answer, no.
Yeah, it's not true. It brings water actually into the cell with it. So it will help hydrate you. And I would actually recommend it for people taking icing in the heat to try to fend off heat problems and heat tolerance issues, with one caveat that there's no pre-existing health conditions that you can't metabolize it very well. But other than that, everybody would probably do better. There are data that show maintaining core temperature for a longer period of time. You know, you have the dehydration sort of sets on at a later point, and I would call it protective. And that's just from a heat tolerance perspective. I think that was mostly his question, but I take it, my wife takes it, it's in kids' things. I give it to my parents, I give it to my wife's family, because it works in so many different ways outside of sport. I mean, mostly for me, I take it more for protecting my brain than from a muscle performance perspective.
Well, Scott gave you the thumbs up, so we're good there.
If Scott gives me a thumbs up, we're good.
Yeah, I drop it in my coffee every morning when I'm pretending to be a barista. So we could almost segue into a conversation about supplements, nutrition, and just discuss creatine a little bit. But so I wanted to go back to something you said, because you brought up the concept of testing products, right? And then so obviously EliteForm is a product. And one of the things Chris and I talked about, and I have a bit of a struggle with, is I always find it interesting. So EliteForm has never actually tried to go out and solicit, hey, please research our product, do a validation study, et cetera, because it feels to me like as soon as you do, that sort of creates a question mark just because you've taken that step, right? So how do you think about testing different products and then sort of the impact that has? I assume you're just going to go with what the science tells you, right? But for people who don't know, how does that process tend to play out? Because I've actually been very shy about dealing with it. So if someone has come to us, we're in, right? Because we feel good about what we've done.
Yeah.
But that doesn't seem to be the way a lot of companies operate. And so I'm just curious to your experiences kind of on that as a whole.
Yeah, we've had experience with that in a number of different ways. The best examples of companies are, like you're saying, where you completely trust your product and believe in it. And when that is happening, and I approach you, let's say for a grant or something, and let's say it's in your budget somehow, you write it into your budget for a year.
I love that optimistic viewpoint. So yeah, let's go with that.
Then it's to a place where so a couple of caveats here. If I approach you for a grant, I won't take it unless I have all rights to the data to do whatever I want with it. Okay? If you tell me that I can run the study, but I can't publish it or present it unless you give me
it's positive. Yeah.
Right. And that's a scenario we run into, and universities tend to put it down, and faculty shouldn't take that deal either. I can tell you once in nearly 12 plus years of doing this, I've done that once. And that was because it was a big grant and it could fund a lot of my doctoral students, and it wasn't a dissertation. It was simply a project we could run. And that helps a lot of different areas. But we do not accept those contracts because we have to be able to publish it. If it's a student's project, that's their calling card. They have to be able to present that and get their next job, by talking about those data. So that's an important thing with industry funding, is that the university, the academics, have all rights to publish whatever they find across the board. Now, some companies handle that differently. I tell that to some companies and they run for the hills. And that makes me know what kind of a company it is. And then other companies will say, that's okay. If it's not positive, that lets us redesign our product, or that lets us inform our customers that we're going to make a new formulation, or we're going to increase the dosing that it says on the bottle because it's insignificant, or it's not enough to actually produce a result. And we've been very, very fortunate to work with a number of companies that have wholeheartedly believed in the product and let us publish whatever we find out of those data that are coming out of it. So that's really the hardest part to deal with, though.
Makes sense. I mean, well, my attitude would be it's all about process improvement. So if I turn that into an EliteForm conversation, if you find that for whatever our power cleans, right, aren't as valid as some of our other lifts, now I just know where I need to focus some attention, right? But obviously, I'm sure there's a lot of different games that people play in terms of that. But
well,
so
I tell you, there was one. This is a good story. There was one time I had a student run a project. We published all the data, and then about a year later, I got a text message from him with an ad from a muscle magazine that said, "Dr. Ormsbee at Florida State approves," and I never gave permission for that. And then it was like, X product works 37 times faster than the placebo. And I'm like, we didn't measure how fast something worked. So somebody got a hold of the raw data or the information we shared, kind of changed it and massaged how they wanted it to do at the company and made this advertisement. So I would say that many times, at least in my experience, you can probably pull something out of your hat that is worth sharing as a company. But if you look at the actual data, it doesn't always support what's going into the advertising.
I want to take your quote out of context, and then I want to just take this small part of it and put it in my marketing. Yeah, I can imagine. So back to sort of listener questions, which sounds like a buzzword phrase. But so Chris Caviglio, connecting some dots, who actually did a validation study on our stuff, actually is hoping you can talk a little bit more about creatine in the brain. Like you kind of mentioned that as some of its benefits. Mind expanding on that a little bit?
Sure. The more and more data that comes out around clinical uses of creatine, the more I am convinced, and I don't know if Forbes is still on here, but his group, Darren Candow, Scott Forbes, other university professors at University of Florida. There's also some from Canada, like McMaster University. Mark Tarnopolsky does a ton of this work. They're looking at clinical degenerative disorders where creatine is helpful to resist degeneration and to help with myelination and help with speed processing and cognition over time. And so from someone who's just, my entire job is typing. It's my head. I have to be on, and I take it simply because if I can stop a little neurodegeneration, then I'm surely going to be all about that. There's also a history of that in my family. I've got grandparents who have passed away from some degenerative diseases of the brain. And I'm like, well, let's see what I can do, but worth trying. And then if you ever read Tarnopolsky's work, it's amazing to see what he's done with neuromuscular dystrophy patients and children especially. The ability to sort of correct or help alleviate some of the symptoms of those conditions are just astonishing. And I also think from a concussion standpoint, so there's data that show if you have it on board already and then get concussed, that you might return more quickly than if you don't. And then I'm only aware of one study, I'm not sure it's been replicated, where they gave it post-concussion and still had a good result. So I'm not so positive on that would work. I'm pretty sure it has to be preloaded first, but I think there's more data that needs to be sort of researched there. But because of those reasons, any kind of neurodegenerative pop and the clinical aging and if I combine, I'm going to get old, I'll probably lose a little muscle mass. I'm going to do everything I can to defend against it, but creatine is going to be on my short list of things that I'm going to take without cycling off of it forever.
Makes sense. How do you do, Chris? I see Chris has commented awesome. So,
okay.
I guess it was a pretty good answer then. So segueing a little bit. So are you training for anything?
The last competition I was in switched away from all the endurance, and I did the 2019 CrossFit Open, which was my first time doing
Really?
anything like that. Yep.
How was that? How was that experience?
It was brutal, absolutely brutal. I was so after hockey, I got into never competitive, but more like bodybuilding type training. And then I went from that to 70.3, so half Ironman distance endurance training, just to be competitive again. It's just, you need something to fuel that fire.
Sure.
And then a couple of things happened. One, like I was getting injured from running so much and just the general pains. And then we had children, and that threw a wrench in like how much time I could commit. Like 6-hour rides were not possible. And I didn't, maybe they were possible, but I choose not to spend my time doing that, at least for now. And so I went to short burst activity. It was kind of my hockey days, like replicating one shift that's super hard, and you just want to get on the bench and puke your guts out. And I was like, you know what, maybe I'm made for this. I have some strength background. I can hold a little bit of endurance, and it was really fun to compete again, as an older athlete at this point. But yeah, it was great. It was fun. Each week you try to get yourself ready for one brutal workout, and I got it handed to me. I thought I would be good, and I was pretty bad. It's always humbling to remember how bad you are at something.
So, but then, will that motivate you in the sense of wanting to go back and do it again and just mark improvement, or
yeah,
like
definitely.
what are you thinking of next?
Yeah, it'll probably be another one of the opens. That's sort of what I've gotten into now. My lab also, just as a group, has started doing some of the Spartan races and those types of things. So I don't know. There's something nice about any event, toeing the line, and then looking around and seeing your students and being like, I'm a lot older, but I'm going to win. So, sometimes that's it. And the best thing is if I lose, I've got the old card I can pull out and say,
you can just play that anytime. Somehow I don't get the sense that you would really play that too often. Like, you just kind of, do you have more of a age is just a number attitude when you compete?
Yeah, not really.
You know too much, right? You know too much for that to really pan.
But, with this whole COVID, all the gyms shut down, and I've gotten back into more running now and riding a bike a little bit again. I've been out of that for a while. I have a beautiful bike sitting on the wall. I had to pull it out and dust it off and get it going again. But I do have a little garage set up, so that's been really nice to be able to continue progress. And then, with the kids and my wife, we take a number of walks each day to get just general physical activity. We know sitting around is not good for us, so certainly try to get more movement now.
Oh, for sure. Well, I've been trying to talk Chris into doing an event. There's a local event. It's a gravel race, 150 miles, called Gravel Worlds. And so I think my plan is going to have to be, we'll get Chris out on the road and then just try to wrangle you in as well. Right. So what kind of bike do you have?
I've got do
you have some tri-bike thing?
I do. Yeah. I have a really nice tri-bike I got right before my second 70.3. And I just called it Black Beauty. It was a nice Cervelo. I loved it. When I drove,
they make nice bikes.
It cost more than the car I drove it home in. Which
a lot of cyclists would say that's the way you should do it. So
yeah. So,
yeah,
but unfortunately, it's been a dust collector now. But if you do a race with Chris, the only race I've ever run, a 5K, under 20 minutes, he essentially ran backwards, yelling at me to run faster, so I would finish it in under 20 minutes.
And just to let you know that he was running pretty fast. Was it sort of a combo play?
Yeah, and you know what? This was like college days, so, showing up not even in tip-top, probably went out the night before, running backwards, and I was like, oh my goodness. But you know what? He got me to the finish line in under 20, so I'll take it.
Gotcha. Well, motivation comes in many forms, right?
Right.
So a couple of other questions have come across, and we have about like 5 more minutes. One of these is going to be kind of hard to read, but your idea about high intensity exercises and open window theory, I think, is what they're going for. I don't know if you can see that on your screen. But.
I can't see it, but I'm not sure what context that's in. So I probably need to know more about what that means in general.
Gotcha. Can you see the one below that? Does high intensity exercise during quarantine have a harmful acute chronic effect on the immune system?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's certainly immune repercussions to high intensity exercise, but for most people, you're not pushing it really as hard as we think, and it's not as often as we think, and it's not over days and days. So I would not be worried about it in this quarantine situation. Very few people, in my opinion, would hit the level of intensity and the duration and how many days it would take for that to be chronic enough to be a problem.
What would be, just playing off of that, so what would be some benchmarks in terms of truly actually reaching that level of intensity? Like, if I'm just trying to think of someone who just goes out running, like, so say like someone's just trying to utilize something simple like a heart rate monitor or some of the more sort of consumer based measurement tools that you might have, like any guidelines there? I mean, I'm kind of the instrumented guy, right? I go out with the heart rate monitors on, right? We're looking at watts, all of those things.
I go back and forth. Sometimes I love that, and then sometimes it's so freeing to have absolutely nothing on and just go.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I try to stage it, right? So I'm going hard today, right? So I'll call it instrument up, right? But then there are going to be days, I almost call them like an Instagram day. So there's nothing on. I'm going to try to take a cool photo, right? Those kinds of things. But no, we were having this conversation, I was going to say in the office, which is not true, in our chat, just to sort of around that idea of, so people are trying to social distance, and they're trying to sort of be healthy within this quarantine situation. And there's a lot of, I don't know if misinformation is, there's not a lot of great information out there on exactly how to handle that. Any thoughts there?
In terms of exercise?
Yeah. I'm just trying to play off the question.
Yeah. I mean, I think that number one, I think your audience are probably people who actually truly exercise and not just sort of physical activity. So I think we can skip right to that part. Physical activity, good. And exercise, good. You know, where you see the immune consequences are like, there's data like right after a marathon, you're more susceptible to upper respiratory tract infection. So that exists. That's a long period of time. Normally exercising for quite a while. You know, not many people are running that in 2 hours like we're seeing these days.
Well,
most of that's a longer period of time. And so if you did that repetitively, I think you'd have problems. I think it's just a matter of instituting the general exercise physiology principles, which are like scale up accordingly and also recover. You need to build in rest days. Like sometimes athletes or active people are so undisciplined that they can't take a day off.
Yeah. Guilty as charged.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, to me, it kind of has, what I've seen is boiled down to, it's just sort of business as usual if you're following an appropriate training plan.
Yeah, I think so.
And no one's really going out and doing solo marathons right now anyway.
There are some. I've seen some of these online Ironman events now people are doing. So they're just recording their own times and then posting them.
Sure. Well, I'm actually guilty of setting up an online stage race for everyone who's sort of type A competitive. So it's through the month of April, 5 different routes that I created, and we're all just going to add them up and see who's got the lowest time. So
yeah, I like it. I mean,
call me a hypocrite.
You get people active and involved. I think that's great, where you can push yourself like that. But the immune problem, I mean, in general, exercise will be immune boosting, but it's usually moderate intensity exercising where they're seeing that. So a walking, a low jog or something. So if you do the high intensity stuff, don't just do that solely. You know, we've got research on all of that to show that multiple different types of exercise are important. The high intensity as well as the low intensity. You know, you look at endurance, like there's this 80-20 concept where 80% of your time is super slow and very aerobic.